Good afternoon and welcome. Um, my name is Thomas Ellis. I can't see myself at the moment. I'm a little freaked out, but I'm hoping you can see me. Um, Welcome to the conference. This is a repeat of the conference that we had just a couple of weeks ago. If many of you were not able to connect with us, we're doing an encore with the same panelists. For all of you that are joining us, welcome back. As we're getting started, Bill, I want to go back to you for just a second. Right now, I just see 7 panelists in my chat box. I don't see, not the chat box, but the participants. I don't see a list of attendees. Can you or Chelsea see the attendees? Bill, can you hear me?
It looks like we're getting some now. It looks
Okay.
like folks
I see
are-
they're trickling in, I
Yeah.
think. Okay, great. Then I'm going to just give them a couple of more minutes before I formally announce, because right now it looks like just a couple of attendees. Is that what you see, Chelsea?
Yes.
There are 14 and going up.
Yes. And Chelsea and Bell, this is what I was referencing just a second ago. On my screen, all I can see is the 7 or 8 panelists. I don't see the attendees, but when we did this before, I could actually see. Oh, never mind. I can just switch back and forth. I'm good.
Cool.
And Thomas,
Yes.
can you correct my name if that's necessary? Because there's 2 Malik Simbas.
Oh, I see. I cannot correct that.
Okay.
We're the only ones that can see that.
Okay.
Yeah. We're just going to get started. Right now, we have about 7 attendees, and I just wanted to let a few more trickle in.
Thomas,
Yes.
you have 15 at the moment.
Well, the 15 includes the attendees and the panelists. So the panelists include the 8 of us that are authorized panelists. That would be you and myself, the 2.
Okay,
Yeah.
I understand.
So the other attendees are listed separately. You can click on to the attendees and you can see that.
Mhm.
So what the computer's doing is just combining the attendees and the panelists.
Okay, well, let's go forth.
Okay,
People might be coming in later.
okay. So welcome again. My name is Thomas Ellis, and I'm the program coordinator of African Studies here at California State University, Fresno. We are going to do an encore presentation of our African American Intellectual and Thinkers Conference. I think this is our 14th annual. This is a repeat performance from 2 weeks ago. So if you saw that one before, welcome back. If this is your first time, welcome for the first time. I'm going to take a moment to introduce our panelists. And I'm introducing the panelists in order of their presentations. Right now, you should be able to see a screen share with the title "One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest." That is the PowerPoint of our first speaker. And our first speaker is Dr. Clarence Spikner. He is currently a professor of public health at the University of Washington. His research includes the fields of health of marginalized populations and the intersection of popular culture. He has published extensively on tobacco-related behavior and organ and tissue transplantation, as well as on the attitudes of public health providers toward minority populations. He created and teaches what may be the first course in public health discipline on Black lives and police violence, and has taught a complete course on the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks, by highlighting the institutional racism of the academic researchers. He also has directed his own study abroad program in London since 2007. Dr. Speichner's also published, for those of you that want further research on his presentation, his current essay on Blacks in Public Health can be found on blackpast.org. You can visit that site at your leisure. Our second speaker, you know what, Dr. Simba, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the second speaker right now, and I'll reintroduce the second speaker again when the first speaker has concluded. Our second speaker, Dr. John McClendon, is a Michigan State University faculty member, go Spartans. At that capacity, a full professor in the Department of Philosophy. His areas of interests include African-American philosophers and philosophical traditions, African-American philosophy, African philosophy, Marxism, the philosophy of sports, and the African-American experience, and the philosophy of religion in African-Americans. He's also has a considerable number of scholarly articles, book chapters, books, monographs, and encyclopedia entries. Dr. McClendon is the author of the following books: Black Christology and the Quest for Authenticity, The Philosophical Appraisal, available on Lexington Books, 2019, African-American Philosophers and Philosophy, An Introduction to the History and Concepts and Contemporary Issues, co-authored with Dr. Stephen C. Ferguson II, Bloomsbury Press, 2019. He's also the author of The Philosophy of Religion and African-American Experience, Conversations with My Christian Friends, Brill Publications, 2007. C.L.R. James's Notes on Dialectics, and Beyond the White Shadow, Philosophy, Sports, and the African-American Experience, co-authored with Dr. Stephen Ferguson. Kendall Hunt, 2012. Dr. McClendon is a co-editor of the American Philosophical Association newsletter on philosophy of Black experience. Dr. McClendon is presently co-editor of the African-American Philosophy series for Brill Publishers. He is a consulting editor of the Journal of American Philosophical Association and advisory board member of blackpast.org, which you can find Dr. Clarence Speichner's article that he's talking about today. Dr. McClendon is also a member of the editorial advisory board of the electronic journal Cultural Logic. Dr. McClendon also serves on the editorial board of the Journal on African Philosophy. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. McClendon and Dr. Speichner will be starting the first presentation. Dr. Speichner, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Thomas. Yes, I'm very, very pleased to have been asked to present here and to present again. I think I've updated some of my slides, corrected some of the misspellings and typos. I hope I caught all of them, but if I didn't, it's okay. You know, we'll make sure that if you want these slides, we will correct them and send them forward to you. As was reported by Thomas Ellis, my discipline is public health. And when we talk about the coronavirus and racism, it's always important to look at what we see in my discipline of public health as the social determinants of health. In other words, no matter how your health is impacted, it's because of social factors out there, factors that we have some control over, something that we can do about them. Even as you look at this diagram, this conceptual model, at the top at 12 o'clock, you see heredity. You may feel that, well, there's nothing we can do about that. Those are the genes that we're born with. Well, given the human genome and all the things that we know how to do now, we can have some control over that. But if you look over at 9 o'clock there, that is the environment. You see, that is the most determinant of health. That arrow is the largest one. And that has everything to do with economics, education, politics, employment, where you live, all of these factors that have an impact on your health and your health status. And you can see where people come into play there, whether you live in a neighborhood that's over policed and you're more likely to get stopped by the police, and your blood pressure is going to go up. That had nothing to do with what you had to eat. So, the environment has a hell of a lot to do with your health. Now, down at 6 o'clock, you see lifestyles. Now, we're going to talk about that. And we try to make it a point that what you do, whether you're exercise, smoke, drink, or whatever, that we don't blame the victim. All too often, the reason why people engage in the lifestyle that they do, it has a lot to do with their social environment. It has a lot to do with, so these things interact. And then you see over there at 3 o'clock, medical services. That's being emphasized a whole lot now, given this virus, COVID-19 virus and such. But you'll see that it is not necessarily one of the major determinants of health. It is still the environment that comes into play, and that is the largest determinant of health. So that's how we look at it, okay? It's not just one of these things, even though all too often in the media, one thing gets emphasized more than the other. As I was saying earlier, genetics, and I think I saw something in the paper just the other day about with sickle cell anemia, which is a genetic disease, that even you can now get into the gene itself and engineer the genetic makeup of the person in order to get rid of the sickle cell gene that's causing this particular hereditary genetic issue or problem among African Americans. But there was a time when people thought that there was a gene for intelligence. And what they said about us about that, Now it makes, there is no gene for intelligence, okay? But by and large, we know we've all been through it, given who we are and where we are in academia, that they've tried to even say things like there's a violence gene and all of that, trying to blame the genes on social, political, and economic problems. So that was that top determinant I was talking about there. We're going to go through the other 3 of them. There are 4 of them. Let me go through the others. Environment, as I said earlier, that the environment is the most determinant of people's health. And you can see here everything from residential segregation to where we end up with toxic waste sites and the water that we have access to, low-paying jobs, unemployment, living in high density neighborhoods where it's the environment is just not conducive to our health, inadequate education, the way the tax structure is set up here, that if you live in a neighborhood, that's where the taxes go to support the schools that you go to, and those schools are not adequate to bridge the academic gap and such. And then I have, excessive or aggressive policing. We can have a discussion about the cops and everything, but by and large, I feel that we need them around, but we don't need them killing us. So thank God for Black Lives Matter. It's even before Black Lives Matter came around, we had to deal with this, and we will be dealing with it afterwards as well. But the environment, my point is that the environment plays a major, major role in people's health, and it has a lot to do with what I'll be talking about later on about testing, access to COVID vaccines and such. It has a lot to do with your environment. Lifestyle, smoking, drinking, lack of exercise, inadequate nutrition and such. And again, we can look at this and say lifestyle, we make it a point not to blame the victim. By and large, if, as I said the last time, you want to go exercising, you want to go jogging. I live in a predominantly white neighborhood. And of course, white folks running past the house all the time. I get out there and they call 911. So, we got to be, it's just the reality that we're dealing with. Also, inadequate nutrition. Remember I said about the environment? Well, Black folks tend to live in neighborhoods where they have more convenience stores than they have supermarkets that carry nutritious foods. We also live in neighborhoods where there are more liquor stores than there are places where you can get decent food and drink. We talk about issues like having to do with what we call in public health food deserts, where you got to walk, you got to go a long way in order to find a store that's got nutritious foods in and low cost. And then we have food swamps, where there's just a lot of convenient stores and a lot of fast food places and stuff. So, one plays into the other. We can't separate just one from the other. And then this other one, medical services, as we have said before, and you all know, everybody I'm talking to on this list knows this, because so it's a bit redundant, but in terms of medical service, the underrepresentation of health providers in the medical care system, a lack of role models. We're underrepresented in these institutions. Oh, they're pulling us out now. They go down and go to the hospital and try to find a Black person in order to tell them, so we can tell folks that you got to get your vaccination and all of that. But before, they didn't come looking for us because it was hard to find us. And so when we look at our society and systemic racism and such, we have to keep this in mind. So we've got these social determinants of health. And I've named all four of them, everything from hereditary or genetics to the environment, to lifestyle, and then health services. Now, these things all play into our health status, and which has gotten exacerbated by COVID-19. And we can have some discussion on that. So now what I'd like to do is to really go through the intersection, which is what this conference is about, the intersection of COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter. And so when we look at this, let's consider that scholars like Du Bois has been dealing with this, a century ago. So this is nothing new. And I've just pointed out there where you guys know him better than me. I've read both of his books, but what Du Bois was writing about with the Philadelphia Negro and the souls of Black folks, this was the social lifestyle, access to medical services and disenfranchisement, and who we were as a Black people. And so he was already writing about this stuff to begin with a long time ago. So now when we hear folks, I see some of these white commentators and stuff, it seems as if they had to go and study their notes to talk about, oh yeah, there's racism and we're dealing with this, it kind of makes you wonder about these folks. But anyway, that is what's going on with Black disenfranchisement. We have always not been given our due in terms of what it takes in order to address inequalities in health. It's always been fostered on us. I like to talk about, when people are talking about Tuskegee all the time, but Harriet Washington dealt with this a long time ago. I mean, she took it back to slavery to begin with. And here I've entitled this A Definitive History of Racism from Medical Thugs to Corporate Gangsters. And there have been a lot of medical thugs out there. And I'd like to thank John for reminding me of this guy, J. Marion Sims, the father of gynecology. Okay, y'all, I talk about blood pressure going up, it had nothing to do with salt in the food, okay?
Yeah.
This is the thing that this is the stuff that makes me angry.
We
Is this being
understand.
recorded? Okay, all right, edit it out
Right.
if you have to. But this is the kind of stuff. This guy's from South Carolina, where I'm from, J. Marion Sims. And again, they got statutes of him. I think it was one in New York. I think the feminists tried to tear it down during the 90s and stuff when they realized what an obscenity it was to be celebrating this guy. But J. Marion Sims, and again, you know, this is medical services, and the reason why Black people don't trust medicine. And that's why that's going to be one of the key points that I'm making here, that we have every right not to trust the medical establishment. But I say at the same time, you know, folks, I want to make sure I get this out. When that vaccine becomes available, we got to be there and we got to be in line to get it. But to the degree that folks say, I don't trust these folks, then I respect that. I respect that as a scholar. And, you know, we shouldn't be putting people down because they say they don't trust the establishment. I don't blame them. So we have J. Marion Sims. We got a whole bunch of other folks here. During the 1918 Spanish flu, that they called it, this was biological racism, biological determinism was dominant. And there was this view that we weren't even human. Now, again, when I get phone calls about where were Black folks doing the Spanish flu and everything? Yeah, where were we? Nobody cared. I mean, there was no data on us. And if there was data on us, people had this assumption that somehow, because we were Black, we were somehow different or the opposite of white people. And so when we look at this, we want to say that 1918, 3 years later, we had the movie that came out, Birth of a Nation, and then 1920. After that, a couple of years, we had the Tulsa race riots. Now, I want to make a point about Birth of the Nation. Now, one might think that, well, you know, that's a movie. So what, you know, what is Clarence talking about? It has to do with our lack of not being able to control the narrative. You know, this movie came out and it gave a rebirth to the Ku Klux Klan and made them the heroes. And those guys have been years. So it says I've been muted. Did I say something wrong, yo? I'm getting a notice saying, oh yeah, okay, I'm back again. Okay. And but controlling the narrative. So let me just go, I'm not going off topic here now, but I just want to say a little bit about the controlling the narrative, how the reason why we feel the way we do is because we don't have control over the medium that can put the word out there about society, about who we are, about what we are, and such. I've just kind of picked a few of the films out, since Birth of the Nation is a movie that everybody from Spike Lee to Ryan Coogler, if they expect to get their authority to go out and make films in Hollywood, they've got to watch that film to see how technically brilliant it was. Racist as hell now, but technically brilliant. And so here we have, this is Butterfly McQueen in Gone with the Wind in 1939. They were always bragging about this on classic Turner Classic Movies and such, and it won an Academy Award. And it's, you know, the South, the Deep South, and how the rebels lost cause, and how romantic things were, and how happy Black folks were then. And this is Gone with the Wind. I am thoroughly convinced that Clint Eastwood, Republican, you know, okay, yeah, hey, he calls himself a libertarian, but that when you find cops killing people and all of that, a lot of it has to do with in the 1970s and such, when he came out with Dirty Harry, and there he was, you know, with his gun. I think he had a problem, maybe a sexual problem with carrying that, you know, 357 Magnum around. And I wasn't the only film critic to actually point that out. But by and large, you have this kind of mentality that, you know, shoot first and ask questions later. And we see that in The French Connection. And you always wonder why cops are shooting folks in the back. Well, this movie won an Academy Award. That's Gene Hackman down there. And he's shooting this so-called assassin. This guy couldn't hit the broadside of a barn. But anyway, he's shooting him in the back. Again, the movie won an Academy Award. And just to make my point here, everybody likes Creed. I certainly do. I watched the movie over and over again. But Rocky, where the movie came from, this movie came out, won an Academy Award as well. It was about a white boy who just goes out and beats up a bunch of black people in the ring. And that's all it was. Rocky was the great white hope. And they got a statue of this guy in Philadelphia. Now he's he's a film character, for God's sakes. I don't know how many statues we got of black people, fighters for real, who fought in the ring and fought racism and overcame everything. But this guy, Sylvester Stallone, has a statue of himself in Philadelphia at the top of the steps there. And when Rocky came out, this movie became the Great White Hope, and it was symbolic of Ronald Reagan and ethnic white people pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. We don't need government interference with anything, symbolized by Rocky, by Apollo Creed, wearing those 4th of July red, white, and blue flags in his trunks and stuff. Let's go a little bit further. Bear with me just a little bit more, because I'm a Vietnam vet, and we lost the war. And then Stallone comes back and he wins the war all by himself. Again, the angry white male. This is building up white people, okay? This is what this is about. He comes back and he re-wins the war and always got his shirt off. I don't know what his problem is, but anyway, he's so he re-wins the Vietnam War. And as I understand it, when I was in Vietnam, that Stallone in real life, we are about the same age. He was at a girls' college somewhere in Europe. Now this is this one here, The Blind Side. I don't know if you've seen this, but white folks love this because this again takes racism out of the equation. This white woman, a Southern white woman, she's based on a real character. And they take this poor guy in, this black guy who just, he's just his family, all black folks are just terrible. But these Southern white folks come along. And this guy, the husband, he is wearing an Ole Miss shirt. In other words, they're just rubbing it in our face, folks. They're using Hollywood, they're using their power to control the narrative in order to change the dynamics of racism and discrimination. And of course, we all know about The Help, and which is the subject itself is dear to me because this is the kind of work that my mother had to do, had to clean up white folks' home and take care of their babies and take care of their kids and listen to their domestic problems and trying to help them along. Meanwhile, me and my family and my father and my brother and sisters, we're at home and we can't even pay the light bill. So, but so this is The Help. This kind of what do they call it? White savior complex. So again, I don't mean to get off topic here, but it was really, really important that when we look back at Birth of the Nation and the impact that had on race relations, that it's still happening. It is still happening in Hollywood. So let's move on a little bit further. People talk about the Tuskegee syphilis experiment all the time, and they are absolutely correct. You're right about it. But be very careful if you're watching TV, CNN, MSNBC, or whatever, and they got somebody on there and all they can come up with is the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, that there's a hell of a lot more going on than that. It wasn't just the Tuskegee syphilis experiment as to why we don't trust the medical establishment. But interestingly, while folks tend to think that we were Black farmers, Black illiterate shareholders, sharecroppers in Macon County, Georgia, were deliberately injected with the syphilis virus. They were not, okay? It was bad enough what was happening to them, but they weren't deliberately injected with the syphilis virus. The U.S. Public Health Service just kind of sat around and wait to see what would happen to them when they died, and then do autopsies on them. Totally racist and sordid. But in all that time, while that was happening, the Guatemala syphilis experiment actually was going on. And this is where they actually did inject Guatemalans with the syphilis virus, just to see what would happen. This is our healthcare system. And I always like to remember this as well. Eugenics was very much a part of the medical society. And we know about the sterilization of women. They call this, especially Black women and poor women, but especially Black women, and they call them Mississippi appendectomies. And civil rights leader Fannie Lou Hamer was a victim of this. So this is our healthcare institutions operating. And I always like to let my Jewish friends know that if y'all want to get all upset about something, think about the Nazi medical experiments and what happened there. And all this was going on all the time while the Tuskegee syphilis experiments were happening. All of this, all of these things going on while Tuskegee was still happening. The only reason we found out about the Tuskegee syphilis experiments were because a newspaper reporter, I have to remind people in my discipline, it was a newspaper reporter, not a public health professional, that said, wait a minute, what in the hell is going on here? I hear these Black militants raising all kind of saying about Nazi medical experiments going on Black people in the United States, and nobody wanted to believe it. Well, this guy Peter Buxton, did some reporting, did some investigation, and found out that, my God, it really is happening. And this came right over what was going on in World War II. And so we all should have known better, but we didn't. And only in 1972 that it was uncovered by a Freedom of Information Act. And so we go on to Henrietta Lacks and institutional racism. As Thomas pointed out, this is some of the work that I've done and some of the classes that I teach and some of the kind of writing I've tried to do. And with Henrietta Lacks, and we're constantly hearing about Johns Hopkins. And we just found out, well, I knew all before, that Johns Hopkins was a Quaker. So he was an abolitionist, and that's the hospital was named after him. Well, it turned out, just found out a couple of weeks ago, and it's been written up in the paper, the guy was also a slave owner. So he wasn't as liberal or open as Johns Hopkins, the scholars and the doctors and all of that would like people to believe. And of course, the book is a fascinating book that I think we should all read, but we have to be real careful of that. Because again, and I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but Oprah had been pushing. She went ahead and did a whole new rendition where she was starred as Henrietta Lacks, and and just made a mockery out of the whole the reality of it. But then she has guys like Dr. Oz on her program, who gives people a whole lot of erroneous information. And the reason why I will try not to get too personal about this, but we have actually tried to call Oprah to say that, hey, look, Dr. Oz doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. But a lot of us folks are watching his show. So, but she won't even return our calls and wouldn't even return our, so okay. So this is the kind of information and the lack of information and us not being able to control the narrative that we get our health information from, and it's not always fair. So when we look at what's going on with COVID and the intersection of Black Lives Matter, we see where, in reality, folks, that what happened because people were in a captive lockdown and forced to watch their TV because they had nothing else to do, that they witnessed this public execution. They witnessed this guy, this white cop, Derek Chauvin, killing George Floyd. And it just really, really freaked everybody out. Now, which is fascinating because you can see that look on Chauvin's face. He's trying to figure out, why is everybody all upset? I mean, we do this all the time, I mean, really, he's probably still trying to figure out what happened. Yeah. So whether this is a tipping point or not, I don't know, but we will certainly be having some discussion about that. Now I'm going to move on here, and here is the intersections, the factors that impact our lives, Black Lives Matter, Black Lives, and COVID-19. We know that we have more pre-existing conditions. We have more heart disease, stroke, diabetes, obesity, asthma, hypertension, and stuff, which makes us more at risk for COVID-19. So we have to watch out for that. We have to be aware of that. And we know where a lot of this comes from now. I mean, living in a racist society, but we want to be aware of that. A lot of us lack health insurance because of the jobs that we have or the jobs that we don't have. There we are less representation as health providers because of institutional racism. So we know why we're not out front as health providers. And yes, every so often, particularly now, they go digging and they find somebody working in a lab that's Black, and they put that person forward. Not to say I'm not taking anything away from the person now, but they said, hey, look, this person is they're doing work on infectious diseases and stuff. So trust us. But when the vaccine works and we're back to where we were, back to normalcy, the racism is still going to be with us. We have less access to testing and treatment. We do, okay? There's talking about trying to get out to the rural areas and get into neighborhoods and such where they don't normally go except to send cops or 911. So now they're talking about we've got to get the testing and the treatment to the people. And I think they're trying to work through churches and such. We are, as people of color, as Black folks, we are more frontline workers. We're out there. We are police. We're working in nursing homes. We're bus drivers. We're farm workers. We're service workers. We are the ones that are out there. We got no choice. And then when they talk about working from home, yeah, well, easy for some people, but a lot of us just don't have that. We just don't have that resource. Bear with me just a little bit more because I want to talk about those pre-existing conditions. As I've already said, those pre-existing conditions, heart disease, asthma, kidney, kidney disease and such, and racism. Racism is a causal factor in bad health. Lacking the health insurance, a lot of us have to end up going to the emergency rooms and then, getting a bill even there. Underrepresentation as health providers. Yeah, I mean, I've gone to the hospital and stuff, and I've had to get an attitude too, because I remember my son went to the hospital, and my wife and I showed up, and the doctor kept looking at my wife as if the boy didn't have a father, and so I had to get an attitude, and so they had to call the guard. So, but anyway, people wonder how come you people are so angry all the time? Tell them, yeah, well, it's because there are too many of y'all out there, less access to testing and such. We've got that. You've heard me already talk about that. And then we are more as frontline workers. As I said, I've got pictures of a policewoman. We are cops. We are health workers. We're bus drivers. We're the people. We are the mail carriers and such. We don't have the luxury of sitting at home and writing a children's book or whatever you're doing, working from home. We just don't, and that is the reality. And as I said before, work from home. Well, what home? So guys, now it is my honor. I'm not taking any steam away from Thomas because I know he's going to introduce John McClendon. But you're going to find out what this guy has in common, or no, what these people on the right has in common with him. Karl Marx, W.E.B. Du Bois, C.L.R. James, Malcolm X, and Angela Davis. So I'm going to get out the way and, and turn it over to Thomas to introduce John McClendon.
Thank you. Dr. John McClendon, I'm going to have you start in just a second. I want to give Dr. Speichner a question. I don't want you to answer it now. I want you to write it down. It's not so much a question as observation. African Americans, for the most part, have been overlooked in general by the medical community. We have poor access. Well, I mean, people of means with good insurance, like members of Congress, something like that. But regular Black folks in the regular Black folk community with that are operating at or below the poverty line they don't have the same kind of access to the medical field like the president does, or other people of means. My point is, now African Americans are expected to really trust the medical community with regard to the vaccine. Now, I'm not saying that's good or bad, but this group, from the people, from what I've read and from the push that I've heard from the medical community, all the doctors are coming out and saying, hey, the vaccine is safe to go with, which is great. But I think we want doctors to speak up about what happens after the vaccinations, because as soon as we get vaccinated, we're going to go right back to poor health care, high prices with big pharma, and a system that doesn't seem to benefit us. So I just want you to think about that and come back on the other side. I know I'm giving you a lot to think about, but I think,
no.
I think you can handle it.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I can. Thank you. Mhm.
Dr. McClendon, you are on deck. I'd like
Okay.
to reintroduce you to our participants. Dr. McClendon is a professor of philosophy at the almighty and great University of Michigan State. Come on in, Dr. McClendon.
Thank you. First, I would like to thank the Africana Studies program for not only having the first time that we got together, but also seeing the need to bring us back again, because as you see, Dr. Spigner has given us a plethora of information that will provide us with the foundation we need to understand this question of COVID-19 and the virus of racism in such an important way. So first, I would like to thank you. And I'm really surprised that you have this nice clip, even the picture of the lecture that I gave. And thank you so very much, because I've been reading your piece that you did in blackpast.org. And by the way, several other of the pieces, which were very finely written. And so I take it as an honor that we could share this symposium together to hopefully educate a number of people about some very important and immediate problems that we face today. Of course, Professor Ellis, I want to thank you for all the work that you've done and putting this symposium together. I want to thank Ms. Beeson for her efforts, because she's been working diligently behind the scenes to make sure that everything works. And of course, last but surely not least, Dr. Simba, who is the visionary behind this very important symposium, this being the 14th, and I being fortunate enough to be at all of those. And I can't forget my brother Green, who has also been, I believe, a participant either in the audience or as a moderator for all 14 of those symposiums. So I want to thank each and every one of you, and the young lady who brought us to Facebook. My first time on Facebook is today. I believe her name is Belle with the Ethics Center. I want to thank you as well, because that audience and Facebook is a very important social media. And all of my grandchildren have told me that I need to move forward to the social media world. And I have some students who are going to make a commitment, believe it or not. I have several students who are involved in social media professionally. And they told me after our first session that they would support me on social media at no cost, that they, and this one student is a professional. And so I felt very honored by that. And I want to thank Belle and the Ethics Center for broadening our audience. Now, with that said, today's topic, the coronavirus and the virus of racism, race, class, and gender, what I would like to do is to point to what I see as a very significant, unique, and ironic circumstance. That is, the very topic that we are approaching is the very context in which we're having this symposium. That very seldom happens. So why should we be concerned with that? Because if we're going to talk about the coronavirus and the virus of racism, race, class, and gender, then we have to take into account that we can only do this by means of the technology available to us, because we can't go face to face. We can't touch each other. We can't give each other a fist. We can't hug each other. We're doing this by way of Zoom. Now, I want us to think for a moment, and I have something here that I'm going to read to you because I think it's very important to understand what it means to talk about Zoom as the mechanism that we are communicating through, the medium of communication. And I'm going to read to you a quote that I found from Shannon Bond of NPR. And she recently wrote, and I thought this would be interesting for us to know. And she says, Zoom reported higher sales and profits in 3 months, 3 months from May through June of this year than it did all of 2019. In a quarter, Zoom made more money, had more sales than it did in the previous year. In the second quarter, sales more than quadrupled from a year ago to $663.5 million, well above the $500 million that Wall Street analysts had predicted. Profits ballooned to $185.7 million. I'll repeat that. $185.7 million from just over $5.5 million in the same quarter the previous year. The company has seen a big surge in the use of its free services, and it has been pushing to convert many of those users using the free service to becoming paying customers. Now, what is significant here is that while I'm focusing on Zoom, because Zoom is the medium that we're employing here, this Zoom phenomena is not an aberration. So let me read to you another point. And the other point I'm making is about another big corporate concern. And this is an article entitled, America's Biggest Companies Are Flourishing During the Pandemic and Putting Thousands of People Out of Work. Putting thousands of people out of work. So the person who is the chief executive of NVIDIA. Now, NVIDIA is a tech company that produces these graphic chips that are at the core of gaming. And gaming now has proliferated during this period of the pandemic and the COVID virus. I want you to listen to what the chief executive of this corporation had to say. With all that's happening around the world, it's really unfortunate. But, and this is a very important word, but it made gaming the largest entertainment medium in the world. And the data, remarkably, I don't know what happened. Can you see me?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we got you.
Okay, for some reason, I can't see me, but, oh, here we go. I don't know what happened. Okay, let me go on. The data demonstrates in a very graphic way the point that he was making about the gaming business becoming the largest entertainment exercise in the world. Sales revenue for 2019, from 2019 to October 2020, just a little over a month and a half ago, showed a marked increase of plus 46%. Plus 46%. Now, we have to look at this, and here's where the issue becomes very important for us in terms of our discussion regarding this question of how do we understand race, class, and gender in light of the COVID-19 virus and the virus of racism. Now, let's think for a moment. If we look at it from the standpoint of this corporation, we could respond by saying, oh, everyone's playing games. It's not so bad, right? The world is playing games, and that's good. And we're making big profits. We have extensive sales. So the world is playing games. But now we have to push back and say, what is the context of why Zoom and NVIDIA are making these large profits? And here we have to go to the core question of capitalism. Because when we look at capitalism, what we understand is that there is a dynamic interconnection. I'd like to use the word dialectical relationship between misery, disease, and death with those who are powerful and wealthy becoming wealthier and more powerful. And when we look at those things in their interconnection, then we can understand then that while this looks like people are playing games, the fact of the matter is that 100,000 small businesses in less than 2 months at the start of the pandemic were completely liquidated. And we know that a great number of those were Black small businesses, the mom and pop type of things that were set up in our communities that when this thing came, they got wiped out. Let me go on. In April, the unemployment rate reached 14.7, which is the highest unemployment rate in the history of this country since the Great Depression. People aren't playing games. They're losing their jobs. They're out of work. But let me go on. Moreover, as the Economic Policy Institute reported, unemployment claims hit the highest level in months. And this report just came out on December the 10th. 26.1 million workers were unemployed or otherwise out of work because of the virus, or who have been forced to drop the number of hours they work and the amount of pay they get because of the pandemic. But that's not all, because now we want to go back to the very important point that Professor Spagner brought to our attention. And here we go. Many of the people who were losing their pay or removed from their jobs depended upon health insurance that was tied to their employment. So either if they were unemployed, they lost it, or if their hours were reduced, they weren't eligible for health insurance, even though they continued to work. And so what that means then is that with the disproportionate number of Black people who have been forced into what is now referred to as the service sector of the capitalist economy. They have become so marginalized that even if they do work, they have no means for health insurance, for health coverage. Now, have we hit the bottom of the barrel here? Well, no, we haven't got yet the full ramifications of what it means to talk about the virus of racism and capitalism, because now we know, and it's been documented, that the largest number of any group among the homeless are African Americans. And you don't have to go to Mississippi, or you don't have to go to Georgia, or you don't have to go to Alabama to find out that. You can go a few miles from Fresno to LA, and you will find one of the serious crises. And Dr. Spagner, when you talked about this whole thing about working from home, that came right on time. Because what we know is that homelessness does not offer an option about working from home. You have no home. Now, in this present crisis, and this was pointed out in an article in a recent study that was done regarding lifting the eviction moratorium. That is, forcing people from their homes. We're not talking about those who were already homeless, but those who had homes, but in light of the pandemic, are now faced with being pushed out of their homes because of the relinquishing of the moratoriums on evictions. How many people have been involved in that? 400,000 of those who have been pushed for their homes have now become COVID-19 victims. I'll repeat that number. 400,000 people who were, before the pandemic, in a home that now is not in a home, are now not only homeless, but infected with COVID-19. 400,000. So this very important piece written by Reverend Liz Theo Harris, and she caps that off, I think, with a very good title. And the title is, "We Are Experiencing Mass Abandonment Amid Abundance." We are experiencing mass abandonment amid abundance. So how do we explain these profits and great sales on the one hand, and the unemployment and the homelessness on the other? And that's why I have in the title of my talk, Capitalism and Death. Capitalism and Death. When I went to Cuba, what was the most striking thing that hit me when I was in Cuba was that the Cuban people were guaranteed health care and education. Two of the most fundamental things we need to survive: education and health care. That was free. You didn't have to pay for it. In fact, the Cubans were so far ahead on the idea of how to bring together education and healthcare that what the Cubans were doing was actually accepting African American and Latino students into their medical schools for free. Now think about it. Think about how many people today are struggling to pay for their medical education, who are now doctors, who have to go in and charge people a lot of money because they're in debt. And here's Cuba saying, look, We know that you as African Americans are facing horrendous oppression. What we want to do is to help you. And so through the Black Caucus and the Latino Caucus, they worked out a deal so that any African American student, any Latino student who wants to pursue a degree in medicine can do so in Cuba free. And I met 5 young women who were students from Spelman who were in Cuba getting a free medical education. Can you imagine that? Getting a free medical education is like winning the lottery in the capitalist United States. So when we hear people talking about, oh, socialism, 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 we don't want to talk about socialism. We got to understand something very fundamental, is that the Cubans through socialism, and despite the blockade against the Cubans, despite the embargo against the Cubans, they are still educating our young African American and Latino students to become medical doctors. And the only responsibility in terms of the cost of that education is that those students have to commit to coming back into the very communities that they are a part of and serving in those communities. Helping with this question of what Dr. Spagner talked about of underrepresentation. Now, when we think in those terms about this notion of capitalism, we have to then ask the question, why capitalism and racism become risk factors for dying from COVID-19? They become risk factors. Racism and capitalism are risk factors. Now, we're using this analogy called the virus of racism. And whenever we talk about racism as a virus, of course, we know that's an analogical way of giving expression to what is a social category. Racism is social. Let me make this clear. Race and racism are not identical. I'll repeat that. Race and racism is not identical. Racism is a particular social relationship between what are races. And I'll give you the definition that I've given to many students over the years. And that definition is, racism is not just an attitude or belief that there exist superior and inferior races. More importantly, it is behavior and institutions. Notice what I said, behavior and institutions that give material support to such attitudes and beliefs by the actual suppression of the supposed inferior group. So now when we look at racism, what we want to look at them are the institutional structures and the practices that emanate out of those structures. So when we think in terms of social determinations, we are talking specifically about social institutions, social relations, and social practices. I'll repeat that. When we talk about social determinations, we're talking about social institutions, social relations, and social practices. So why did that become integral to what we're doing? See, because in a capitalist society, the way in which social institutions function is always predicated upon 2 very important things: ownership and management or administration. Who owns it and who manages it? Then everyone else is subservient to those who have the power to do so. So if we look at, for example, the medical profession, the first question we have to raise, well, who owns it? Who manages? And we will say that most of the people who go to clinics, who go to emergency services, as many of our people do, because of the lack of insurance, health insurance, what do most of our people do? They don't go to doctors for preventive medicine. They go to emergency rooms because it's the last recourse for a person who has no insurance. And here I'm speaking as a scholar and also personally, because I've been in situations where I didn't have health insurance. And I remember one time I was very, very sick, and my wife was trying to get me to take an ambulance to the hospital. And I said to her, I said, did you ask them how much it cost? And she says, no, I don't know how much. And I said, well, given the fact that I don't have health insurance, it's better for me to wait this out and hope that I make it through than have a big bill that I have to pay for months or years. And then, my already bleak situation living in the hood gets worse, because I already found out when I was living in the hood that my car insurance went up, not because I was a bad driver, but because I lived in the hood. So without health insurance, what could I do? So I said, I'd suck it up. And that's what I did. And fortunately, I didn't die. But how many of us in that situation, in the current situation of the COVID-19 pandemic, have to make the choice? Can I afford, even after you have all the symptoms, when you're no longer just asymptomatic, because we hear a lot of people are said to be asymptomatic with the COVID-19. I'm talking about people who are symptomatic, and then they say, well, can I really afford to? What kind of choice is that when you live in a society where profiting from your disease and profiting from your death takes precedence over your very life? And so now when we begin to think in terms of this notion of racism as a virus, then we have to become aware that racism is rooted in social relations, institutions, and practices. And so, what is then racism in light of capitalism? That's the question that we have to address. I have in my paper, and when I finish the paper, it's going to be made available. Dr. Ferguson, Stephen Ferguson, told me that he will publish my paper in the American Philosophical Association newsletter for philosophy and the Black experience. And Professor Ellison, and I just want to say, in your introduction, I'm no longer the co-editor. I used to be the co-editor, but Dr. Ferguson is the co-editor of the newsletter. And my paper, which has all the documentation and data and sources and all the rest of that, you can read the complete paper. But I always think, if I may make an aside, that in these situations, rather than read a paper and everyone, fall asleep and in the end say, what the heck did he say? I'd rather make it more open to the audience and then let you read the paper and see all the details. So it's not like I'm winging it and I didn't do any research. In fact, some of the research I picked up happened in the last week that will I document what I'm saying. But what I want to do is get down to this core question, because where we understand social determination is fundamental to understanding health. What I want to do is to make a specification as to what is social determination. And here that specification is social institutions, relations, and practices that are framed within a capitalist society. So when we look at such things as where Black workers are located, such as frontline workers, it's kind of interesting because they use this term now, essential workers. And you would think that if you became essential to anything, that means you're more important than everything, right? What is the essence of something? Is that which is the most important aspect of that thing. In philosophy, we talk about the dialectical relationship between appearance and essence. That which appears and that which is the essence is the defining feature of a thing, right? So if you have a hairless cat and you have a chihuahua, they will appear to be very much alike, but in essence, you have a feline and a canine. And so they're fundamentally, that is, essentially different. So when we talk about essence, if we call someone an essential worker, we're saying that that worker is fundamentally necessary for the whole operation of the system. But then we have to ask, why then are all these essential workers who are on the front line, like many of our African American women, as we speak to the question of gender in terms of race and class, and we say gender, all these African American women who work, for example, in places like nursing homes, or work as people who are generally referred to now as domestic workers. In the old days, we used to use the word maids, domestic workers, and their work is essential because without their work, you have unsanitary conditions, and then the people who work and live in those conditions are subject to infection. So we call these people essential workers, but they're essential, but yet what? The lowest paid workers. Think for a minute. If you have something that is essential to your life, then you do what? You give it the greatest amount of attention. And that which is inessential, you can give less attention. But why is it then that who we call essential workers are found to be the lowest paid? Only in a capitalist society. Only in a capitalist society, because in a capitalist society, what we have is what we call a categorical inversion of reality. Everything is upside down. Wealth becomes centralized and concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. On the other side, what happens? The expansion of poverty and impoverishment, right? Just like I talked about, 100,000 businesses in less, at least 100,000 small businesses in less than 2 months were completely wiped out in this pandemic. What do you think happened to those people? They went from struggling from day to day to become, quote, a petty bourgeois, business owner, to now struggling to become not homeless. Because you're not living from one day to the next, because you could have the pride. I know there's a number of Black people who own businesses because it's a certain pride in saying, I own my own business. I don't work for the white man, right? There's a certain pride in saying that I take care of myself and I answer to no one. But what do we know about the reality of capitalism is that the big guys eat up the little guys, that McDonald's is flourishing while small Black-owned restaurants are being wiped out in this pandemic. And what happens to those people who are wiped out? They go from being petty bourgeois to being homeless. Many of the workers go from working from paycheck to paycheck to no check and homeless. And so what we have to understand is that within the context of this pandemic of COVID-19, then those social determinations, which are most decisive in terms of what happens as a result of one's position within the environment, is one which is dedicated to perpetrating the very relationships that lead to impoverishment. That's the point I'm trying to get to. If you don't understand it, when people talk about systemic racism, remember what I said? Racism is not just an attitude or belief. More importantly, it is behavior and institutions that give material support. Where does that material support come from? Well, let's talk about it. Who owns and controls? Who owns and controls? Today, they are debating right this very minute a 900 billion, is that correct? 900 billion?
Yeah.
Deal about, beg your pardon?
No, go ahead.
900 billion, yeah.
900 billion.
Yeah.
Is it 900 billion?
Yes.
Okay. And what is one of the things that is on the bottom of the totem pole in terms of priorities? What's at the very bottom in terms of priorities? It's a check for poor people. That's at the very bottom.
Mhm.
People are debating, should they get $600 or $1,200? They're debating that.
Yes.
And we already showed you how Amazon and all these big corporations are making millions of dollars. And here's the person who was strapped to the very end. And they're going to debate whether or not, well, should someone who has employment get supplemental unemployment? How are they going to spend it? And that's, my fellow students and fellow panelists, is the point I'm trying to make. Why we talk in terms of capitalism and death. And that when we look at what happens in terms of gender, what is happening to our Black women in this society, who most, as we all know, work for a living. Very few Black women in the past 50 years have had the luxury of saying, I'm a stay-at-home mom. You know, they talk about soccer moms. Black women are all kinds of moms. They're at the soccer game, they're at the basketball game, they're at the football game, they're at everything, and they're at the job. So how do we look at this system that would crush them and say, look, you don't deserve $1,000 after you've been reduced to, even though you're still employed now, it's such a low pay that your pay can't meet your basic needs. Only in a capitalist system would you would allow then someone like a Mitch McConnell say that the red line, the thing that is at the crux of whether they can reach an agreement, is whether or not the corporations are protected against the people who they may, through malfeasance, injure, and say that they have to be protected. These corporations be protected. These hospitals and medical facilities be protected against the people that they harm. That's the key question. Well, if that's the key question, then you understand why capitalism spells death. In conclusion, and again, I'll share my paper so that you can get the gist of all the things I had to say. But I want to conclude on this note. And something that I was analyzing and I got real excited about, and I shared it with my wife and daughter. And I said, you know, I just figured out something that's important for our discussion. And what I figured out, we've heard a lot of things come from the Trump administration. And we know that Trump is not the brightest, you know, light on the guy, you know, he's not the brightest bulb on the tree. We know that. We know that. We know that he's a very special person. And we'll, you know what I mean by special. He's a very special person in that regard. It seems like it's run down the family tree, but I'm not going to go into the genetics of the Trump family. But what I am concerned with is that as I began to analyze the political economy surrounding this crisis, there was one move he made that was not made out of stupidity, but it was made out of his class interests. And that was the move towards what he called herd immunity. Herd immunity. You've heard that term, right? And this guy, Fauci, is that his name, Fauci? Dr. Anthony Fauci. Fauci. Yeah,
Yeah.
Dr. Anthony Fauci was all upset with Trump of talking about this herd immunity. And he says there's no medical science that could support that idea. And he was right. There's no medical science that supports that idea. But Trump wasn't operating from the standpoint of medical science. He was operating from the standpoint of the political economy of capitalism and what we call capital accumulation. And let me spell this out for you. In the process of capital accumulation, And we see Trump was not alone. In fact, most of the leaders of the various countries who are now struggling against the pandemic are capitalist countries, and therefore they had to look at this question in terms of how to continue to accumulate capital. And whether we do that or do you shut things down, preserve health, and then start over. And so the compelling issue for any capitalist is to keep things running. Because if you shut things down in terms of their particular sector, they can't make profits. Capital accumulation is a process of developing what we call surplus value, which is at the heart of profits. So when this idea of herd immunity came prominent, it spoke to this drive for capital accumulation. In other words, let them all die, who cares? As long as we can make our profits. It wasn't that Trump and others did not understand medical science. It was that they understood their class interests. In conclusion, we, as Black intellectuals, as doctors, as public health experts, have a moral and social duty. In fact, a higher responsibility to not just merely follow behind what all of these different people say, the CDC and all these other agencies. In fact, the CDC, as late as November the 30th, as late as November 30th, how many weeks ago was that? 2? A little over 2 weeks ago, the CDC had to correct its data on the rate of Black deaths in comparison to white deaths from COVID. How many knew that? Probably not many, right? Many of us did not know. It wasn't until 2 weeks ago that the CDC corrected what was wrong data respecting the death rates for Black people in comparison to white. The CDC had been saying it was twice the number of white people, that Black people were dying at a rate twice. After Elizabeth Warren, you know, the senator from Massachusetts, questioned the statistics and the racial demographics used by the CDC, she forced them from her status as a senator to reassess their data. And what they came up with on November 30th, just 2 weeks ago, that the number is actually more than almost 3 times the death rate of white people. Now that's very important. That's very important because if we're going to try to convince Black people that you ought to take this vaccination, but yet we don't critically assess the very institutions who now want us to run out and say, oh, this is what you need to do. The skepticism that the masses of our people have is consistent with the reality that they live. We can't talk about Black people being backward because they question these institutions that they have no power over.
Right.
And the only power that we have as Black intellectuals, public health experts, and people in medicine, the only power that we have is our knowledge.
That's right.
And so what we must do is to offer the highest level of research, of critical thinking, and creative thinking to advance, so that when people ask the question, how and why Black lives matter, we can provide them with the substance to continue in the struggle for African American liberation. Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McClendon.
We have a few minutes for Q&A. What I'd like to do, since we have a small number of attendees, I want to try to see if I can get us to get a little bit closer to what we would do in a normal panel, and that is have the audience go ahead and reach out and ask questions. So attendees, if you would type your question, your name and a brief, description of your question, I'll read that off, or I'll have you read it off if you'd like. And those of you that are panelists,
Mhm.
you're all basically unmuted. You can mute yourself. If you just raise your hand, I will be able to call on you. I want to reach out to the attendees first because they're typically students. But of course, all of you know that students sometimes can get kind of shy. So panelists, get ready. Those of you that are panelists but not speakers, get ready to ask some questions also. And to the speakers, this is going to be a Herculean task for you because as educators and professors and scholars, I know it's kind of difficult to answer questions succinctly because you like to use context and history and all of this. But the shorter your answer, the more questions we can get in.
Mhm.
Okay, if you can. I know it's hard, but try that. Dr. Speichner, I put a question to you about the dichotomy between the medical field and African Americans, and now African Americans are kind of ignored by the medical community, but all of a sudden the spotlight is on them to get these vaccinations. And I'm kind of wondering, once we do the vaccinations, are we going to be forgotten again by the medical community? So that's essentially my question. Those of you that have questions as attendees, go ahead and note that in your chat and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. Dr. Speichner, you have the floor.
Thomas, thank you. Thank you very much for that question. And I confess, I really don't know the answer. That is what really worries me more than anything else. And I try not to be cynical. I can remember 40 years ago when I was young and they'd have some old professor, telling me that I need to have faith and this and that. And I was saying, yeah. And now it's like the Twilight Zone. I'm that elderly, that old professor. And when someone asks me, okay, what is the future going to be like? Do I sit and be very cynical and say, oh, it's going to be awful, nothing is going to change? Or do I say that, hey, look, keep hanging in there. And, we are a resilient race. That doesn't mean survival of the fittest and all of that. But by and large, we have been through so much that we just have to keep on keeping on. But that is a very, very good question, Thomas. And I try to at least not to be so cynical to say that, oh, it's going to be awful, because then nothing changed for the whole time that I was, growing up. And, things change, but then they remain the same. So, excellent question. I can only hope some of certainly my white colleagues and Jewish colleagues think that this is a tipping point. And, I don't know. I said, I really don't know. I can only hope that it is.
Dr. McClendon, same question to you. What do you think is going to happen with after we get the vaccinations? Is the medical community going to go back to us as a forgotten people? And I'm saying, using those terms advisedly, but you just mentioned African Americans get a better healthcare system in Cuba than they do here. So
yeah. Well, I think it's a question of understanding that healthcare is not separated from all the other dynamics. The significance of, and what I was trying to point out about COVID-19 and this whole thing about police violence and state terrorism, they both are dangers to the lives of Black people. If we ask how and why Black lives matter, they matter both if you're faced with a police officer. Let's take Breonna Taylor, for example. She was killed by the police, but she was one of those essential workers, frontline workers. She could have very well died from COVID-19, right? As so many other Black women have who work the front line. So what we have to understand is that the question of power and the question of control, of ownership and control, which equals power, is what we have to fight for. We can't think because out of goodwill that the medical profession, as it has always been, is going to change after inoculating Black people around COVID-19. That's not how it works. It's a systemic system. It's not about your attitude or belief. It's about the nature of the system itself. There's many, I just read a very interesting piece on how algorithms have been utilized to keep Black people from having kidney transplants and heart surgery. And when they were not done with the intent of being racist, but the impact was that. So I was reading about this young man. It's a very startling piece I read because we don't have enough time. I didn't bring that into my discussion today. But this young man who was born with diabetes, his mother died before she was 40 years old from diabetes. And he was trying to survive to get a kidney transplant, had to use daily dialysis, and yet the algorithms that they had developed would not allow him to get a kidney transplant because of the way the demographics were looked at. Now, that wasn't like Tuskegee, where there was an intent to just merely, but the institution impact was that way. And so we who are in the position to critically look at those things and make that aware to our people, I would say we can't predict the future, but we surely can present a battle that will shape what direction it goes in.
Okay, great. We have a question from Dr. Jenny Bond, who's a professor of Asian American Studies at Fresno State. I'm going to unmute you, and then Homer, I think you have a question. Do you want to go after? Okay. Dr. Bond, are you there? Jenny, are you there? We have you unmuted.
Read her question.
Yeah.
Dr. Bond's
Oh,
question
okay,
is,
sorry. Sorry. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. My question is, how can Asian Americans, what can Asian Americans do that would offer inter-ethnic solidarity with African Americans? I'm thinking of Black Lives Matter, but Asians for Black Lives Matter, or do you think that there is a place for Asian Americans to support African Americans?
Hell yeah. Pardon me, Dr. Bain, but Asian Americans are already doing it from what I understand, from what I can see. They're out there in the streets in Seattle and every place else from that I've been able to see, where they have their banners up and they're raising hell just like everybody else. In terms of this notion of overrepresentation in the academy, I have always argued that when you look at the 25 distinct ethnic groups under the Asian American umbrella, that so-called racial group has been not given the respect that they should. In public health, in my discipline, we do a whole lot of counting. And we calculate p-values. We get a large sample size and we homogenize the Asian Americans with, if you're Vietnamese, Chinese, Japanese, Laotian, Cambodian, and then we put the Indian Americans in there, Kamala's population, and there's enormous ethnic differences under the Indian American population. And in the academy, we have allowed scholars, we have allowed researchers to get away with that. And I tell my students all the time that to hold their professors accountable, hold society accountable, and not let themselves be homogenized under that one particular category. So in terms of what Asian Americans can do, first of all, don't accept the academic status quo or even the policy status quo that you guys are Asian Americans, so you're a model minority, so you got no problems, let's move on. You know, you say, wait a minute, hold on, back up here, you know, that we're not going for that. And there's one thing I like about being involved in this in this forum, because I'm talking to historians. And so historians can look back and see where we came from and know that what didn't work in the past and what has happened in the past that's got us in the situations that we're in now. So, you know, we can talk about the Japanese internment and everything else. I will not let a society get away with that, or have them say that, well, you know, you folks are a model minority, you got no problems. We'll look at Black folks. I tell them, hey, yeah, well, you know, when your when your wife is an Asian American as well, and your kid is Asian and Black, you can see why I have a personal and a professional concern about something like that. So to answer your question, what can Asian Americans do? From what I can see, they're already doing it. But of course, we can always do some more. And don't let the status quo, don't let the politicians, don't let academic researchers get away with homogenizing everybody under the same so-called racial category. Count the p-value, publish the article, and then move on, because you've been given a serious disservice.
Dr. McClendon?
Yes, one thing that the way in which the COVID pandemic reflected itself specifically in this country is how the Trump administration tried to make it the Chinese and all the other very reactionary ways in which xenophobia and racism came to bear, and what that meant in terms of, I remember seeing the graphic picture of an Asian person being beaten in New York City on the subway. And I think they spray painted the person. It was horrendous. And so the threat to Asian Americans throughout the country became very intense. I don't know if it's even lessened at this particular point. So I think for those who may not be aware of the long history, going back to like Karimatsu, which was the case that led to Japanese Americans being put in internment camps, or going back to the 19th century with the Chinese Exclusion Act, or going back to the South, and Dr. Simba has written a very good article on what happened in Mississippi to Chinese when segregation was based upon color, and the Chinese says, well, we're not Black. And the law determined, well, you may not be Black, but given our categories, you're going to have to go in that direction. So I think what we have to understand is that racism and I add this, national oppression is very important to understand. We didn't have time to talk about it today, but in brief, I argued that this is not one nation, that this country has always been a multinational state with the dominant ideology being profoundly false in its representation by saying one nation. This has always been a multinational state, and that a part of racism was linked to national oppression. And that was true for Asian Americans, that was true for African Americans, and that's still true as we look today at places like Puerto Rico. The one reason why Puerto Rico was treated the way it has through all the natural disasters that have happened is because Trump didn't understand that Puerto Rico was a US territory. He saw it as a foreign country. Remember, he said to the governor of Puerto Rico, let me speak to your leader. I mean, he didn't understand that as president of the United States, that was, so the point I'm trying to get to is that we have a very fundamental question to unite with Asian Americans around the question of class and national liberation.
Thank you so much. Homer, you're on tab. I just want to remind all of you that Homer is a philosopher. And so this might get a little complicated, everyone.
No, the philosophical question will be for Dr. McClendon.
Okay.
Yes.
And then after that, it looks like I have Sylvander has a question about socialist capitalism, and perhaps we can get Lawrence Lewis from Michigan State in after that if we have time.
Okay.
So,
Dr. Springler, I want to get your opinion on President-elect Biden's team that he's putting together to combat COVID-19. And there's also a woman who's African-American woman who's going to be in charge of equity, making sure that the vaccine is distributed to all different minority groups and everything. So I'd like to get your opinion on that.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. It's interesting to see how how it's going to shake out. What I find interesting is that And again, we can have our issues with, Clyburn, but the reason Biden knows, the only reason he's sitting in that chair now is because Black women. Let's give the credit to Black women in the South. Were able to rally and get the vote out for him. So now he's making his cabinet as multicultural as it has ever been. And I think it's really, really part of the democratic process for different groups, including us, Asians, Hispanics, to keep pressuring Biden, no matter how hard it is, the saying that, hey, we want our piece of the action and we want our representation on your cabinet. We're not going to sit back and just let in order to put an olive branch out for the Republicans because we've been so divided. AOC and the others are really, really pressuring him. And I think that what's happening with the woman, I don't know her, but that doesn't mean a whole lot. A lot of people I don't know, that he is making the effort. And we will be holding him accountable. I certainly hope that the society, everybody does, holds him accountable to make sure that we are able to address some of these inequalities in health. It is so insurmountable, Homer, that again, I try not to be cynical about it, but at least we see something that's that might be quite positive here, and we'll see how it shakes out. But you got Mitch McConnell. I mean, that dude is something else, man. I mean, he'll say no, just like that. I mean, no concept of democracy at all, and such. So we really have to see how this shakes out. But yeah, that's my view. Yeah.
Homer, was that question for Dr. Speichner only, or was
No, if Dr. McClendon would like to take a piece of it, he can.
I just think that it's a question of representation can be very tricky because representation can lead to tokenism. That is to say, we're represented because a person sits in a particular situation. I think the key thing is that there has to be a critical mass of people, whether they are part of that group or not, that critically assesses what the group is doing and calls their actions into question when necessary. Because what we often think is that, well, we got a black face on such and such a committee, that may happen, but Clarence Thomas has been on the Supreme Court how long now?
Yeah. Excellent point. Yeah.
Savander had a question.
Yes.
Yeah, this is for Professor McClendon. How are you, Dr. McClendon?
How you doing, brother?
I'm doing well. It's so good to see you. My question, and I kind of know some of your feelings about capitalism and a little bit of your feelings about socialism, but I'm wondering about some sort of amalgamation, since it appears to me that the American population is not buying into socialism, regardless of how it's permitted, but it perhaps may be more palatable if it's joined with capitalism with tethers. What's your take?
I think there's two things involved here. One, we're talking about the question of ideological dominance. Karl Marx said it best: the ruling ideas are that of the ruling class. So unless you have a critical assessment of the society in which you live in, you will always succumb to the dominant ideology. So therefore, you have to have what I call 3 levels of critique: empirical, which is questions of fact, questions that deal with the actual state of affairs, which is what happens with the CDC and their miscount, right? Questions that are conceptual, to deal with theory, the theoretical and methodological questions. So if I had more time, I would have gone into Dr. William R. Jones's notions about how he looks at the very idea of racism as a virus. He has a very excellent format of talking about the virus of oppression, and he talks about the predictability of racism, and then how do you develop the antidote, the antitoxin. But we didn't get to that. And then the next level is one of worldview. Now, at the worldview levels, where you really get down to it, because some people who buy into capitalism will be the very people who are most exploited by it. So be aware of the fact that I was listening to some people in West Virginia who were die-hard Trump supporters, and they were super exploited. These are poor white people in West Virginia, have no clue about what the heck is happening to them. So at the level of worldview, we have to begin to challenge the dominant ideology. And so one of the things I tried to do in my presentation today, because many Black people don't understand capitalism in its relationship to their day-to-day life. They understand racism to their day-to-day life, but then they separate it. That's why one of the problems of the factor theory approach, race, class, and gender, is that all factors are given equal weight. My argument is that the system itself is capitalism. What brought slavery was capitalism. It was profits from exploiting Black labor. Why did it continue to do so? And Dr. Simba's book points that out, his book on Black Marxism and American constitutionalism, is that they wanted to continue to exploit that labor. So once we understand that how the system, and I say the system is not solitary, a system of white supremacy, it's a system of capitalism which utilizes white supremacy in terms of capitalist interests. So to answer your question in conclusion, I would argue no. The idea that capitalism and socialism can be combined in some way is what people thought of the New Deal. What Roosevelt did with the New Deal by bringing in state apparatus into the capitalist market, that was not socialism blended with capitalism. It's what we call state capitalism. State capitalism, and more precisely, state monopoly capitalism, which is very much in play today because the state gives the most money to, when we look at the government's budget, who gets the most money? It's the military. The military gets the largest part of the pie. Is that socialism? If Jeff Bezos, is that his name? Bezos of Amazon makes billions of dollars and the government gives him the break of not paying taxes for 2 years and then only 1.62% of his billions in the third year, which was, 2017, 2018, 2019. Is that socialism because the state gave him that tax break based upon Trump's tax break plan? No, that's capitalism. So we have to understand it's not just merely the state's involvement in the market. The key question is what class has power and control over the system. And as long as the bourgeoisie have control of the state, then you'll have capitalism. And they don't care, as much as they talk about free market and private initiative and all the rest of that, none of them say, you'll never hear Bezos say, I won't take the tax break you gave me because that wasn't a matter of the free market, that was a matter of manipulating the state. You won't find any of these corporations who get contracts with governments where they make billions of dollars. They say, well, I won't take that contract because it wasn't based upon the free market, it was based upon the state. Why do you think they have people who go and pressure politicians and sometimes bribe politicians? Those people who do that are involving themselves around the state so that the state works on their behalf. The problem is that poor people don't have that kind of weight. And even a Clyburn, as much as he tried to do, I call him Uncle Cly, because he didn't even understand that at the point in which this primary was going, there was a better chance with Bernie than there was with
Biden.
Biden, yeah.
Given that, John, what do we do given the fact that I don't see capitalism going anywhere?
Well,
So
see, the question is this: when you struggle and you understand the need for fundamental change, you have to understand that fundamental change happens through a protracted process. So when you understand the protracted process, then you go through stages of struggle that advance to the fundamental aim. I mean, people in Ghana, before Nkrumah came back, did not see the possibilities of Ghana being independent of the British. In fact, Winston Churchill says, the sun shall never set on the British Empire. But between 1947 and 1957, Ghana became independent. No one thought the Congo would become independent. The Congo had less people educated than we as African Americans in terms of the percentage of the population. But Lumumba led them to independence. Who thought Vietnam would gain its independence from US imperialism after being under the yoke of France for centuries? But they gained their independence. So the question is, it's not whether capitalism can change or not, because it's not a static question, it's dynamic. What do you organize? How do you organize to bring about changes that then awaken people to the fundamental contradictions? You see, if I'm a person who spent my whole life doing everything that capitalism says you need to do in order to be successful, you work hard, you feed your family, you try to own a home, you do all those things, and in the end, you wind up poor, then you have to ask the question, was it me, or was it that the game that was set up was designed for me to lose? So I don't buy into the idea it's the only game in town. The question I use as my criteria is, does the game include my interest? If it does not, it's like playing the lottery with your life savings. It's not designed to help you get rich, though some people do. It's not designed for that. So I would never take my life savings and throw it on the lottery. I have some friends that say you can't win if you don't play. And I always ask them, how many people do they know who played, who's won? And that becomes the stalemate. Capitalism is not designed for the success of working people. It's designed to exploit working people. Given that, then we have stages of struggle, better working conditions, better support for transforming the health conditions of people, which is what we're talking about now. And when you fight all those things, then you begin to say, well, wait a minute, maybe we need to have a different healthcare system than the one now that leaves so many Black people in disease and death. Maybe we should think about that, because as I was talking to a friend of mine today, he called someone up to congratulate them on their birthday. And in the middle of the call, this person who just had a birthday, they called to let him know that his son died of COVID. This is a Black person, of COVID-19 on his birthday. His son died. We have to think that when you're in a situation of life and death, you can't talk about how do we choose between the slave master and slavery. There's no way in which the two work together. They're mutually exclusive. And this is why the Cubans say socialism or death. They understand full well that before the Cuban Revolution, they had death, they had crime, they had the mafia, they had all these people. They were turning the whole of Cuba into no more than a game house for pimps and exploitation. Now they can hold their heads high in knowing that. How many Black people can really hold their heads high in this country and say this country has done something for them? The constant refrain that we hear in Black history is the idea of what Black people contributed to the United States. That's what Carter G. Woodson built his organization around. Negro contributions to the United States. But the fact is, no one ever asked the question, what has the United States done for Black people? No, because we always answer by saying what they have done to us, not for us.
I got one question for Dr. Smigner and Dr. McClendon. And welcome to the social welfare state created by FDR. The iconic program, of course, is Social Security. Okay.
Dr. Simba and doctors, before you respond, are we set to adjourn at 4 o'clock? We have 6 minutes left.
Okay. Well, I don't know if the Bell or Chelsea can address whether or not we have leeway to go over.
I believe the Zoom webinar will continue running until we exit, so we can go over if we need to.
Okay.
So the question, of course, is the social welfare state iconic program is Social Security, okay? But one of the failures, of course, of Obamacare, the Affordable Health Care, is the elimination of the public option, okay, in which the monopoly state would moderate and compete with the private healthcare corporations. So I was wondering, Dr. Spigner, with Biden if they get lucky, which I don't think they will, and control the Senate, or if they can flip 2 GOP senators and create a public option for the healthcare, then state monopoly would be in contradiction and competing against the private sector of corporate healthcare. And I just want to know how you guys see that as a possibility and what would happen, because that would certainly decrease the cost of healthcare.
Well, yeah, it's an excellent question. One of the things that we have when you try to study the U.S. healthcare system, we often ask ourselves, is this really a system? It's an absolute mess. And but we do know that it is both public and private.
Alert from Vice Enrollment.
Okay. It is both public and private, but dominated by the private sector. So it's a market-oriented healthcare system. Sometimes we try to refer to it as a market justice system, but that's a contradiction in terms, especially in terms of poor people, because by definition, poor people do not do well in a market system where you have to buy your health care. And again, you've heard Bernie say this enough, so I'm being redundant, but we're the only industrialized country in the nation that has this kind of market-oriented system. And so we've got private and public. You know, Walter Reed, the reason why the Trump survived is because he went into that. That's a socialist system, really. You wouldn't call it that, but you know, we have the VA. You know, in spite of what we think of the VA, I mean, I may end up there myself. I'm a veteran and everything, you know, but that is a public system. I mean, that is, you know, you go in there, you don't pay anything, and you pay in terms of having been a soldier and done, you know, done work and all. But and you mentioned, you know, Social Security and stuff. So we have aspects of public and private in our healthcare system, and the challenge is going to be, just as Lawrence knows well, because that's where he was coming from. I think Angela Davis, in her, I'm not mixing things up here now, but Angela Davis, 50 years ago, because she was a socialist, I mean, she had clashes with a lot of the militants, a lot of even the Black Panthers, because they felt that, hey, you know, you're talking socialism. That's a foreign ideology, you know, and she was saying it wasn't. Well, she's still here and they're gone. I mean, you know, but I'm not going to get into John's territory now, because he's going to rip me apart no matter what I say here, you know, because you know, but just to answer the question though, and I know we're running out of time, we have this duality, and it's a mess, and that Biden or anybody, or even Bernie, they're going to have to try to stay within this capitalistic system, but try to infuse socialism into it and not call it socialism. For some reason or other, it's a buzzword, as I've said in the chat, and you say socialism, people get all upset. When Castro took over, and he was always communist, and he threw the rich people out and everything, and brought in socialism, and people are still angry at him because of that. You know, that's why the Cuban Americans in Florida, and you know, tend to vote Republican all the time, because they're angry at what Castro did for the poor people. And of course, John has already told us about, you can go down there and get a medical degree and come back and do some work that we desperately need. Whereas here, they don't want to let you in the medical schools behind some crap that, you know, oh, you can't, you know, you didn't add the number up right or something. But anyway, yeah, that's my response. Yeah, sorry, it takes so long. Yeah.
That's okay. Briefly, a lot of people really don't understand the notion of the welfare state. And so I just want to say 3 things. One, that's a euphemism, because really what happened under Roosevelt was the development of state monopoly capitalism. And the welfare state notion blurs the real fact that state monopoly capitalism allows then for the capitalist system to no longer operate under the notion of laissez-faire, where the state no longer intervenes. And that was because the economic crisis that created the Great Depression was a crisis that actually shattered the notion that a free market system without state intervention could develop and continue to grow. That's what the Great Depression was all about. It put into shambles bourgeois economic theory, and there was no way out because the theory was the market would always find itself back in equilibrium, even though you would have ups and downs. The Great Depression was a down, and they kept sinking and sinking. And so the theory known as Say's law, Say was a political economist, Say's law was destroyed in the Great Depression. So what happened? This crisis brought about something very similar that we see with Black Lives Matter. That is, people went into the streets. They began to demonstrate. They began to organize. They began to make demands. There's the emergence of industrial workers in something called the CIO, which later becomes the Congress of Industrial Organization, which was mass workers, because unions before that were only the elite labor aristocracy in the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. And these movements, along with a very strong Black movement that included Black sharecroppers and rural workers and Black people who began to organize themselves from the grassroots, challenged the state. And so what happened was that there were certain benefits that derived from the Great Depression and the struggle that was there, such as Social Security, which, by the way, in the first CARE Act language, and I just read it closely the other day. I was surprised. I asked several people, they didn't know. But do you know in the CARE Act that was passed that they allowed corporations not to pay into Social Security? Businesses did not have to pay into Social Security. That was a part of the CARES Act. But in any event, what we see now as we talk about Obamacare is that this public-private division is simply a matter of the state versus the private market. The question is, the state is not opposed to the private market because those who run the state are representative of the private market. That's why we call it state capitalism and not socialism. That's why the bulk of the revenues that come from the state do not go to the working class, do not go to poor people, they go to rich people. So until the question of who controls state power is fundamentally changed, then we cannot see a healthcare system emerging that will adequately address the questions for poor people, and particularly Black people who find themselves disproportionately among the impoverished, the poor, and the working poor.
We have time for a couple of more questions. I see Lawrence Lewis from Michigan State. And then we have a couple of others. Panelists, if you could be succinct, that would be great. The university frowns upon us keeping staff past 5 o'clock, so I want to be mindful of that.
Sure.
Lawrence, are you there? If not, I can read your question.
Yeah, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, great. This is really for Professor McClendon, but also other panelists. But, you know, given just the expression of capitalism as like kind of a corporatist disaster capitalism, how do we combat the seduction that it's the only common sense? And I'm just interested to kind of hear, whenever, you know, there's this talk of other alternatives, other types of systems, it's, well, that's just too hard. It's failed in other places and nothing changes. So I'm interested, and you hear this even from people who are within economically constrained communities. And so I'm interested to kind of hear from you all, particularly Professor McClendon, how do you combat that seduction when, you know, trying to build some type of economic futurism that we can all try to shape and have a responsibility to shape?
Great question. I think it goes back to this notion of education for liberation. You see, you can go and get all kinds of degrees and have no clue about how the political economy of capitalism works. That's why I refer to Dr. Anthony Fauci. And while he was concerned about this herd immunity notion, he had no clue about political economy. He was just functioning from his narrow view as a bureaucrat who was apolitical. And he wanted to stay apolitical, but the state is political. So you can't be in the state and be apolitical. It's a political game. So if you're in it and you're apolitical, then you come in naive because you don't understand how the game is played. So the con is going to be played on you. And that's what happens when you don't understand that. The same way for people who are working people who are exploited by capitalism. The thing is that political economy is very much an ideological battlefield. You cannot study political economy in most institutions in the United States today that critically look at capitalism. The last time you could do that was back in the late 60s and early 70s. Since then, they fired all those people and they just changed. So what you're going now, you're being trained to be captains of industry, to work on behalf of capitalism. So that's why that matter becomes something outside of the bourgeois institutions, why it becomes a grassroots question, why you have to organize people and explain to them in terms of the scientific analysis and critique of capitalism, how that's related to their day-to-day life. So when we want to understand why is it that we find a certain percentage of Black people in a certain sector of the economy, we have to understand then the political economy of capitalism and how that works. Unfortunately, we have very few Black intellectuals who understand the critical conception of capitalist political economy. Very few who even read the first volume of Marx Capital, let alone all three, or in addition, theories of surplus value and other works that would be instrumental to understanding capitalism. So our job is to first educate ourselves. Karl Marx once said that one of the great tasks is the educator being educated. We have to find more and more bourgeois intellectuals who are willing to commit what is called class suicide and give up all the bougie ideas that they have and the ideology that they embrace and begin to rethink the world in light of the interests of the working class. And then utilize that springboard to educate the rank and file. It is my belief that Black people historically, when offered the opportunity to rethink their circumstances, are more than capable of doing so. And this is why the Black struggle has been a dynamic part of the struggle for liberation overall in this country, because working Black people are not dumb, they're oppressed. And so what we have to do is understand and speak in clear language so that they can understand the nature of that oppression. It's one thing to say, I know my life is bad. It's another thing to say, oh, I understand now why corporate capital is moving in this direction rather than that direction, why this political party is doing A rather than B. So now we have to organize to do these alternatives. It's a struggle, but it's a struggle that's meaningful. And as Frederick Douglass says, if there's no struggle, there's no progress. Those who deprecate agitation are men who want the crops without plowing up the ground. They want the rain and thunder without the awful roar of its many waters. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, or it may be both. Power concedes nothing without demand. So this is what we got to do. We got to understand it's a struggle. So I say education for liberation is the way to address those grassroots problems.
Question with our Black churches and their spirituality and how they
Hang on 1 second. Dr. McClendon, you faded out for a second. Are you still there?
Oh, did I? Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
I can now. Did you finish? Because I couldn't tell.
Yes, I was finished.
Okay, great. I don't see anything from the other panelists, but I do have a question from another attendee, Marquise McClendon.
Marcus, that's my grandson, Marcus.
He's able to talk. He's right here. If he can't talk, then I can read his question. Marcus, are you there?
Hello.
Okay. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay, yeah, I'm talking through my phone on pause, but thank you to all the panelists
Okay.
for
Gene, sorry about that. I'm doing two things at once. You still there?
yeah, can you
Yeah,
hear
we
me?
can hear him. We can hear him.
I
Yeah,
can
we
hear
great,
you.
yeah.
Listen, can you hear it on my phone or your phone?
Whatever you're doing now, I can hear you very
Okay,
well.
I'll just let you listen on my phone.
Yes, all right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so my question, can the BLM movement be compared equally to the Black Power movements of the 60s and 70s? It doesn't have to be too elaborate. Maybe if it's just deconstructed, probably just to maybe not really the alternative, but just the state of being of both.
Marcus, I'd like to answer that, at least from my point of view. I think, yeah, there are some comparisons, but the BLM movement has far surpassed the civil rights movement. And that is not to compare and contrast and say one is better than the other and all of that. But the lesson that I've learned is that when I was doing my study abroad program in the UK, and when I got back, I heard that some sisters, queer sisters, Black women, had confronted Bernie Sanders here in Seattle and jacked him up and asked him, "What have you done lately, Bernie?" And, white folks were all upset about it. Black folks here were embarrassed. But the sisters were absolutely correct. Bernie started talking about all the things that he had marched with Martin Luther King and John Lewis 50 years ago. And they said, "Yeah, Bernie, that was 50 years ago. What have you done lately?" And they have, the BLM movement have brought together hip hop, something I still don't understand. But anyway, that and Pan-Africanism, LGBTQ issues, the civil rights movement. They respected the folks that did all of that work. They don't put it down, but they build on it. And my view is that, yeah, you can teach an old dog new tricks. I tell the BLM folks, what would they like for me to do? That I've got some ideas, and if they want to listen to them, fine. If not, then I'll hear what they have to say and back them up. So my view is not to be so romantic and everything, but I think that BLM has taken it to the next level, and they've done an outstanding job of it. They're having some issues now in terms of leadership and tactic and all of that, but that happens with all movements. So I'm 100% for BLM, and I think that they've done an outstanding job.
Dr. McClendon?
Yes, I think that the contribution that the Black Power movement made was to shift the dialogue from rights to power. I think that was the most significant accomplishment. And that happened as the Black Power movement evolved, because in 1964, when the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was organized, they saw, according to the Constitution, the right of poor Black people and poor white people who joined the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, the right to go to the Democratic National Convention, which was held in New Jersey, and in Atlantic City, and to say, hey, we challenge these white Democrats who say they represent Mississippi because they have not followed the Constitution. And it is our right to do so. Well, that was thrown out the window. Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was concerned about getting elected, joined with the Dixiecrats, and they basically told the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, we'll give you 2 nominal votes. You can sit around, you can't really do anything, but that's progress. And even Martin Luther King went along with the compromise. That was one of his big failures as a leader. He went along with that compromise.
Yes.
So it became more evident to those in the movement that if you don't have power, you can't secure your rights. So you can have the right to do something, but if you don't have the power to back it up, then anybody can smack your rights right out of your hand. So that was the contribution of the Black Power movement. I think the contribution of the Black Lives Matter movement is still evolving. And that's the great thing about it. In the paper that I wrote on Black Lives Matter that's going to be published next year, and I should say, my paper for today will be published in the American Philosophical Association newsletter. I mentioned it earlier. I'm repeating for those who may not have been here earlier. That's going to be published. But furthermore, the overall project I'm working on now will be a book for next year, 2021, on Black Lives Matter. So both this presentation today and the earlier paper on Black Lives Matter will form two of the chapters in that book on Black Lives Matter. And Marcus, that's a good question, because one of the things I'm going to do is to talk about a comparative approach to movements. And I'm going to talk about, I talk about Black Power separate from the Civil Rights Movement. One of the things I think is that the Black Power movement broke, and that's when John Lewis decided to leave SNCC. And in fact, I show you how deep that break was. Lo and behold, Bill Clinton, at the funeral of John Lewis, took the opportunity to take a crack at Kwame Ture, aka Stokely Carmichael, at the funeral. I don't know if any of you guys watched that. I said, man,
I didn't.
This tells you how hard the Black Power movement hit those people, because Bill Clinton says, unlike Stokely Carmichael, John Lewis stayed the course with liberalism. I said, whoa, that was something. After all these years, he's going to bring that up. Of course, you know, he was from Arkansas, and he was very much a part of that reactionary group. So what we need to do, it's not whether one is better than the other when we talk about a comparative approach. The question is, when we compare, the analysis provides for us a lens for what we need to do in the future. And this is why history is so important, because Black Lives Matter can learn from the Black Power movement. There's another movement that followed the Black Power movement, which is the Pan-African movement. And that became really one of the most significant ties that the Black struggle made to the continent of Africa and the Caribbean. So in 1972, on Africa Liberation Day in Washington, D.C., we had a turnout that surpassed the March on Washington in 1963. And I was there. And I was a part of the people who organized that march called Africa Liberation Day. Now we're at another point where we have more people out in the streets with Black Lives Matter than at that time. So we have to learn and build on those. So the comparison, Marcus, is designed to enhance and develop the movement so that we no longer are just a movement, but we have organizational structure. The only thing that sustains a protracted movement is organizational structure.
Dr. Speichner?
I already had my say on that one. And as I told you, I never follow John. Because
we have what looks like our final question. Fatima's has a question, and while she's getting ready, she's permitted to talk. But while she's getting ready, I want to remind Dr. Simba that he should follow her with his closing remarks. If he has some, I'm sure he does, or any other acknowledgements. I just want to prepare him so he can get his speech ready. Fatima, are you there?
Yep, I'm here.
Hi, how are you? Welcome to the conference.
Good, how are you?
Good.
Okay, yeah, so I had a question, I guess for all the panelists, specifically Dr. McClendon. So we talk about, or you all talk about, you know, this ideation of Black freedom. And Dr. McClendon, you give examples of Africans all over the world gaining freedom from colonial powers. What are your guys' ideal visions of the future? We talk about gaining independence. Could Blacks gain independence in the system of government? How would that even look? Or maybe is it less about gaining independence and more about gaining power in this current system? So those are just a few of my thoughts and questions.
Great. Thank you, Fatima.
Very good question, Fatima. And I should say both Lewis and Fatima are my students here at Michigan State, and they're two of the outstanding, brilliant students that I've had. And Fatima is working as my research assistant. So thank you for that question. Briefly, I would say this. No, it is not about having power within the system, because power within the system means being a part of the system. In other words, if you were living in the days of slavery and you became a slaveholder, you do not diminish the oppression of slaves. You just add to it. You're just a black face on it. And there were black slaveholders. So that's not a far-fetched notion. Two, when we look at power, power is utilized as an instrument to transform. The question is whether that transformation is a reform or a fundamental change, revolution. I am a revolutionary. I believe that we have to have a revolution, that merely having more Black Democrats or whatever, the token position will not change the system of capitalism. I think that was clearly demonstrated not only here in the United States when Barack Obama became president, and right after that, Donald Trump emerges. We can see that that wasn't true power. That one guy who wrote that book, When We Were in Power, he has no understanding of political science. I forgot his name. I think they gave him a MacArthur Genius Award. That was a mistake.
Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Huh?
Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Yeah, didn't they give him a Genius Award?
They did.
That's sad, because anyone can look at that and say, we weren't empowered during the 8 years of Barack Obama. But that's another one. The other side of the coin is this, though, is that in the same manner that we talk in terms of power, we have to understand this, that capitalism and imperialism is a worldwide system. The reason why Africa is in the situation it is today is because of imperialism and something called neo-colonialism. They overthrew Nkrumah. While I mentioned Nkrumah led Ghana to independence, by February of 1966, they overthrew Nkrumah. A year before that, almost precisely to a year, Malcolm X was assassinated. Before that, Patrice Lumumba had been assassinated. And then later, after Nkrumah was overthrown, Amilcar Cabral, one of the most brilliant African revolutionaries, was assassinated. And I can go on and on and on. Imperialism is ruthless. They tried to assassinate Fidel Castro more than 100 times, exploding cigars, poisoning his food, all kinds of things. The thing that he did to survive is that he never stayed in the same place for too long. He would move around all over Cuba. The CIA could never catch up with him. That's why he survived. Many other leaders were assassinated. He told Allende that in Chile, and Allende was assassinated. He said, man, if you don't get control of the army, and Pinochet, the general, took over, shot him, killed him, and remained as a dictator for decades until he just got too old to rule. So it's a ruthless system. This is why we can't talk about combining capitalism with socialism. You don't understand capitalism if you're talking about that, because capitalism is ruthless. It was capitalist interest that led to Patrice Lumumba's assassination. He only wanted independence for his people. But the Belgian Congo, as it was called then, was a rich and still remains a rich source of all kinds of minerals that are very important to us, even in the 21st century. Uranium and all kinds of things that you can't find in any other part of the world. The same is true of South Africa. And that's why the Mandela deal that they compromised on when they brought Mandela to power meant the assassination of the communist Chris Hani, a Black leader who was the true leader, revolutionary leader of South Africa, who was assassinated so that they could pull off the compromise with de Klerk and Mandela. And they gave them Nobel Prizes for that. Look at the state of South Africa today, and you will see one of the worst conditions that Black people have ever lived under the ANC and neo-colonialism. So my point is that, no, imperialism and that's why the Cubans are right. Capitalism and death. That's what it is. And if you're talking about how you're going to mediate living with death, well, I rather try to find a way to enrich my health standards. I always say that health is the measure of one's quality of life. Health is the measure of one's quality of life. And that's why Dr. Spigner, I have such a great respect for, because he's dealing with the fundamentals of the quality of life, public health. And if we're going to get there, I say as a philosopher, as a historian and social scientist, and as a Marxist and a revolutionary, we have to fundamentally change the system. You can't put a Band-Aid on cancer and think you're cured.
Dr. Spigner, I know you have the enviable position of trying to follow Dr. I know you don't like that, so I'm going to buy you a little bit more time. Dr. McClendon, go back to to President Obama's lack of power. Talk about, drill down on that just a little bit, because I think you're alluding to the fact that with the congressional makeup, particularly in the Senate, a lot of his initiatives were just blocked for years. As you remember, he nominated a Supreme Court justice that went nowhere because McConnell wouldn't allow that to happen.
Right.
Because he felt it was an election year. You know that whole fiasco, but what are the other reasons why you feel that President Obama was impotent in terms of power?
Yeah. See, before Obama, my criticism is not over the fact that Republicans showed resistance to Obama. My criticism is directly at Obama and the system of capitalism. See, we have understood our exclusion by way of segregation, Jim Crow, as the principal contradiction. So we see the issue in terms of two categories, exclusion and inclusion, wherein inclusion is the solution to exclusion. So that's why we tend to find ourselves in great joy whenever a Black person is included, right? So we say so-and-so was the first Black person to do A, B, and C. We don't look at what it actually means in real terms, material terms for the masses of Black people. You just got a Black face there, so hallelujah. So what I'm saying is that the reason why Obama's presidency was not real power for Black people, because Obama wasn't there for Black people. In fact, he made it clear. Every time Black organizations came to Obama and said, why don't you do something for us? He answered by saying, I'm not here as the president of Black people, I'm everybody's president, which he meant by that excludes me from doing anything of Pacific interest for you. There will be no Black agenda. He made that very clear. So then you have to sit back and say, well, wait a minute, Black people have particular and specific interests as their long history of racism and national oppression identifies. So if you have a president who says to you, I don't have anything of particular for you, then that president is telling you basically, I don't speak or represent or plan to do anything for you. That's what I'm getting at. So what Obama's role was before he got into office, and the reason, in my opinion, the reason why there was popular support for him being elected into office was because of the economic crisis that under Bush administration took place. And when that crisis became so deep, the deepest crisis this country had faced since the Depression, 2008, white people said, I don't care what color he is, get us out of the crisis. And before he entered the White House, he met with Bush, and they decided the bailout would be by appealing to giving support to Wall Street and then everybody else. Now, we got to be clear about that. He says, we have to bail out Wall Street or the system will collapse. That was Obama's position. And even today, when you listen to what Obama said during the primaries, he says the Democratic Party cannot go too far left. In other words, The reason why he supported his former vice president is the reason why he selected Biden as his vice president, because Biden represents what is called a moderate Democrat. And a moderate Democrat in today's term, if you went back to the days of Ronald Reagan, would have been a conservative Republican. Because the country is moving more to the right. So now what is said to be moderate Democrat is really the old conservative. And this is why we have to understand, and this is my point, you see, what I'm saying about Obama, the same thing I'm saying about Mr. Mandela, that no one thought there would be a Black president in South Africa. Mandela got there based upon a deal. They said basically the masses of South Africans will not have a revolution because we got to save capitalism. Just as Obama saved capitalism in the United States, Mandela saved capitalism in South Africa. Why? Because there was an international movement to divest of South Africa, and the whole system was on collapse. As soon as he came into office, what did the first thing Mandela say? Okay, you can invest again because we have ended apartheid, and that saved capitalism in South Africa.
Dr. Spinkner, do you have anything?
No, just to reiterate what John has said, and I certainly can articulate it as well as he, but to point to some of the points I think I heard echoed in Fatima and Marcus's concern. When we talk about capitalism and socialism, it's like, particularly in an academic environment, that's really about the only place you can get away with it, to tell you the truth. God knows when Angela Davis stepped off the campus after the shooting with James Jackson, and then trying to put him, and then trying to, she was arrested and put on the FBI 10 most wanted list and everything. She continually defined herself as a socialist, but that was almost outside the mainstream, and she had been fired as a university professor by Ronald Reagan, after that, even before that, I think. So, we've got folks like Cornel West. He defines himself as a socialist, and I'm sure John has some opinions about, just how much of it, that. Michael Eric Dyson, I don't think he calls himself a socialist, but he's certainly got a lot to say, motor mouth Michael, he's really good at it. And so we kind of play, these kind of schizoid roles, and you have to decide which way you're going to go, not which way you're going to go, but just how you're going to go about it. It's like code switching. It's the point that Du Bois, wrote about, 100 years ago. So it's, it's just really fascinating, the kind of, I hear what everybody's saying. The business of, I don't want to call it a business, but the notion of socialism and capitalism and which way we're going to go. It seems to come down to a point that I thought Lawrence was bringing up, mentioned about the masses. To what degree, to what extent will the masses accept socialism? Will it accept socialism? Because they certainly have been born into capitalism, and they might not know enough about socialism to really embrace it. And to the degree that they do embrace it will be when a public official or a politician can call herself, I am a socialist, and vote for me. Now, we came close with Bernie. Bernie kind of says it, and then he doesn't say it, and then he's an independent and all of that, So it may be, just time will tell. I hate to always go that route, but it seems as if that is where we are. That will be the ultimate test. Again, John will know the answer to this better than me, but I think it's as fascinating as Marxism is, and it's still around. We still teach it. And such. I think the only place, I'm putting myself on the line here, but I think in Cuba is where they actually did it. It was a capitalist country for all that, we can define it as. You had the mafia going down there and doing all sorts of terrible things and folks just having a good old time down there, by and large. And then Castro, who I think was a physician, came in and had the Batista, the revolution there. So we've actually had the application of communism, the application of Marxism for real in that country. There, I'm sure there are other places as well, but the fact that Marxism is still sexy, if I want to call it that, still an ideology that people believe in, and that people define themselves as it, and it means that it is still quite relevant. But again, the people that we have, the names that we've put out, I recall, I was going to say Thomas Sowell. I mean, he's a black, yeah, I know. Okay, I shouldn't have mentioned that. I shouldn't have mentioned his name. Okay, but I mean, he's an economist, brilliant, but stone capitalist, man. I mean, he just says all kinds of things that, and but to the degree that we have, again, I mentioned, Cornel West, he defines himself how he defines himself, but he and the confrontations that he had with Obama, I mean, that was really interesting. John, I thought some of that stuff was personal between the two of them, but by and large, he felt that Obama was, he said, hey man, where are you with black folks? You're there now, do something, and Obama was saying, hey, gotta chill, dude. I gotta be for all the people, not just for black folks. And of course, Black Lives Matter have, and Alicia Garza, they've taken Obama on about that. They said, hey, man, you were late at the game on that, But again, I'm rambling, but that is basically where I'm coming from with that. It's a kind of duality we have to play. It's kind of a code switching we have to do, and that aspects of socialism and communism, and maybe in another 50 years or something, we can define ourselves, the masses can define themselves as socialists and socialism, and it's not such a negative word that we automatically turn off.
If I can say quite quickly, and I've written some things criticizing Cornell, so I'll share those with you. I wrote a piece on Du Bois, King, and West. And I do a critique of, I'll send it to you. Okay. I do a critique. I always thought Cornell was trying to play like he was progressive, but he was really not. And he started that off very early. His doctoral dissertation is written on Marx. It's really an attack on Marxism, but it's supposed to be for Marx. So I'll send you some critiques I've done, but that's going to be coming out soon. The other thing, though, is Dyson is another one of those people who, basically he says the two-party system and capitalism is the only game in town. And so he's locked stock with Biden. He was with Reverend Al, with all the preachers the other day when they met with Biden, and Biden told him, look, you have to wait. I'll get to you niggas later. I mean, that's the kind of position he's in. So it's not something that we can see. See, my point is that leadership is not celebrity. We have bought into, because of the pop culture kind of thing, that everyone who's a celebrity is said to be a leader. So who in Cuba, Ice Cube would have never been taken seriously.
You're right.
And the guy I talked about before, 50 Cent, he ain't even worth $1. No one take these people seriously, I mean, but somehow rappers who have no political understanding get media time in the culture of this country. And that's because a lot of people, it's a new word they use. I just learned from young people who use social media. The word is called influencer. Influencer. And these are people who say, so many people watch my whatever. And so that makes me an influencer. So now you even have professors, and I won't mention any names, who brag about how many people follow them on social media, as if that is the quality of their academic work is based upon the fact that they have they make so much money on media. I'm not going to mention names, but I know both Professor Ellis and Simba know who I am talking about. So this idea of the social media following is the same as leadership. You have to remember this, that when Du Bois and Paul Robeson and Claudia Jones were faced with repression from the state, they were not popular among a lot of Black people. And a lot of Black people in that period, that very intense period of McCarthyism, who were progressive leaders, went to the right. And I can name them all, but I'm not going to do it at this moment. But they all abandoned Du Bois, Paul Robeson, and Claudia Jones. They abandoned them. That's why Du Bois left this country. Can you imagine the most significant Black intellectual of the 20th century, and he couldn't get a job at any HBCU?
That's right.
The Black folks were scared.
That's right.
Of giving him a job. And so he had to go to Ghana. That's sad. That's a tragic moment in our history. We can't romanticize the past. We have to study the past. It's not about celebration. It's about examination. And when we examine that, then we understand that some of these so-called public intellectuals like Cornel West and Dyson, they play that game because they make a lot of money off of it. But that doesn't make them leaders. In fact, sometimes they come off as clowns. It's really, it's sad, you know, so, oh, that's so clownish. What the heck, excuse me, are they trying to do?
That's right.
So what I'm saying is that we have to set standards that say whether it's popular or not is principled. Whether it's popular or not is principled. And so I take a stand. In fact, Paul Robeson's autobiography, you know what it's titled? Here I Stand. And when everybody was against him, they took his passport. He couldn't get a job anywhere. He couldn't sing anywhere. He couldn't act anywhere. He took his stand. He never buckled under. He never did the Ice-T or the 50 Cent or whoever else you want to call up, kind of the Oprah Winfrey and all the rest of that. No, he didn't do that. He took his stand. And so what the legacy that we have to embrace is the legacy of a Claudia Jones, who you never get to hear about, but she was a communist born in Trinidad, grew up in Harlem, and was a member of the Communist Party, who was deported because she was a communist, went to Britain, and she's the reason why they have Carnival every year in Britain. She created that. Claudia Jones is a very good book written by my colleague and friend, Carol Boyce Davies, a biography on Claudia Jones. The fact is that we don't know the Claudia Jones. Many young people don't know Paul Robeson. A few may know Du Bois, but they know Ice-T, they know 50 Cent, they know all these people, but they don't even know what they mean. Our job, education for liberation, means that we got to take our young people and tell them and educate them. And that's why I'm going to go into social media, because that's where they are. And I got people, these young people are going to help me, because I'm like a baby with social media.
Same here.
So they're going to help me. And that's what we need to do. We need to go back and say, wait a minute, this is crap, kids. I'm sorry. This is crap. Don't buy all of this stuff that these people are saying, these misleaders who want to make money and become popular. And they're dangerous. What I see that many people are doing is dangerous, because young people get on social media and they have no way of differentiating between truth and falsity.
That's right.
Fact and inaccuracy. They have no way of doing that. It's like reading Wikipedia crap, right? When you read Black Past, you read something that's gone through a rigorous scholarly process. You read Wikipedia, everybody throws their stuff in. And that's what we have to do. I'll stop there. I get excited, you know, because I'm very proud of the young people, Louis and Fatima and Marcus and Maya and Deja, and those are some of my grandchildren and students, and Christian, Barbara, and Eliza. There's so many of these young people who are hungry to learn. But we have people out, you have to go back and say, no, don't listen to what that guy said. Here, you have to critically assess it. And that's what's happened. See, we come out of a culture and we romanticize call and response. See, the church culture, and I know I'm going to step on some toes. One of the legacies of the church culture that's so much a part of African American culture is that people respond around dogmatism. Black churches do not allow critical thinking. That's why I wrote the book, Conversations with My Critical Friends. You can get it and read it. I lay it all out. I go back to the 19th century and talk about how dogmatism was embraced both in terms of history writing and in terms of social analysis. And it became so deep that people got caught up in that and they couldn't fight. And so many people now just say, well, Pastor said, and that's it. That's all they need. Pastor said, Pastor said.
Mm-hmm.
They can't critically think. If it's in the Bible, it's got to be true. No. How was the Bible written? You have to understand the Bible was not written by a single person. It was not written at a single time. And it was not inspired. Much of it, if we look at go book by book by book by book, came out of theological debates that led one group who had power over another one. And this is why you have contradictions going from one passage to the next. But we don't think critically. That's the point I'm trying to get. We buy into dogmatism.
Yes.
Liberation requires critical thought and creative action.
Thank you so much, Dr. McClendon, Dr. Speichner. I'd like to bring Dr. Simba up for, speaking of the church, I'm going to bring Dr. Simba up for the benediction, but before I do so, I want to once again thank the speakers. I want to thank all the attendees for hanging in there and all of the people that came in under the panelists. We have a few people that are attendees, but they came in under the panelist part of the Zoom. Thank you for joining us as well. I'd also like to thank the staff people that have helped put this thing together that are recording. Belle from the Ethics Center, she was loaned to us from one of our colleagues over there. Thank you, Belle, for being with us and helping us. And Chelsea Beeson for also, she was with us the first time and the second time. And Chelsea, welcome back. Chelsea almost lost her job. She's back at full force.
Good.
And we are looking forward to her helping us for next year. Dr. Simba, come on in. I'm going to give the mic to you. Thank everyone. I thank everyone for joining us and for being a part of the 14th conference. And we're going to do a 15th as soon as possible. Dr. Simba.
Thank everyone for joining the Zoom today. And Dr. Speichner and Dr. McClendon, you did excellent jobs. All 14 will be posted. Ms. Beeson will be working with myself and Professor Ellis to post all 14 on YouTube or another website, Popular. So you'll be able to see the various presentations like the one you just viewed, topics in the past. We brought in the founder of blackpast.org, Dr. Quintor Taylor. He did a presentation on Blacks and the American West. We have had Dr. McClendon talked about his book, Black Christology. We've had speakers on Black Lives Matter. We've had certain speakers speaking on Black women's literature. Dr. Forsgren, she was at UC Merced, then she's moved around to University of Notre Dame, but Dr. Forsgren came in and spoke on Black women's literature, and you know, we did Black Lives Matter, you name it. I started this symposium and entitled it African American Intellectual Thought for the direct purpose that the Black intellect has been the driving force to reveal the contradictions between capitalism and death. And if you look at the intellectual writings of Black scholars, it has really been driven by this question of capitalism and death, the contradictions, okay, the hypocrisy. Next symposium at the moment might be on the new emerging conservative group called the American Descendants of Slaves, ADOS, ADOS. Okay. Right now, it's a small group. I'm tracking that group to see if they will be prominent enough for us to do the 15th on how conservative GOP money is supporting the American Descendants of Slaves, ADOS. It's the exact opposite of what Dr. McClendon alluded to as Pan-Africanism. So again, the 15th tentatively may be on this new idea, actually created by Black conservatives in conjunction with Republican donors called the ADOS. So thank you all for joining the Zoom, and wear your masks, social distance. As Dr. Spagner says, take the shot. I don't mean the bank shot. Okay, take the shot. Take care. Chelsea, Mel, thank you so much. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Thank you all.